Actually, it's with some sadness, that I do ask my question, because I really get the impression hitherto that somehow we're all coming at it from the perspective that until now, perhaps this violence could have been avoided, and especially on Alban's part, there was almost an inference that, in particular, IRA violence could have been avoided. But really, the point I'd like to make is two. First of all, violence was here a long, long time before August 15th, 1969, before the Republican violence really started. The UPV violence, I think Henry was the person that said unionist establishment met the response with violence, at Burncullet, at Duke Street, in the August pogrom itself. But also a point that concerns me to an even greater extent is the almost abject role, apparently, that the British state and indeed the Free States played in this catastrophe, you could say. It's no accident at all that the momentum was on the ground, and it's no accident that those in charge of whatever direction the movement was held was such people as Brolcháin and Francie, because for the simple state, if we look at the Kenyan violence today, until Royal Odinga and the other dudes sat down and had a chat, the actual movement was spiralling out of control. And really, the question I have for the panel is this. Let's critically examine the British state. Before August 69, they had troops in the north, right? I think they had troops in from April 1969. They had the troops there. And this sort of behind-the-scenes discussion to the likes of O'Neill or those Chichester Clark who came afterwards, almost begging or hinting at them to take action. I think Henry especially, I'd really appreciate, because he was the person that raised, perhaps something could have been avoided had the inactivity of the British state been addressed slightly earlier.
Well, I think that's a very interesting question about whether violence. A lot of us are asking whether violence was inevitable, and maybe we're asking the wrong question.
I thought maybe Henry wanted to take off on it.
Well, yeah. Whether violence was. Let's look at the role of Britain, right? And certainly Harold Wilson knew very well of the various injustices that existed in places, particularly in places like Dungannon, because of the campaign of the McCluskeys, because they were producing a lot of material which was sent directly to him, and in fact he'd given some sort of vague commitment that when Labour came to power they would do something to right the situation in Northern Ireland. But when they got into power in '64, they got into power with a relatively small, less than 10 MPs, majority in the House of Commons, and basically they just looked to O'Neill, and O'Neill didn't do very much. And it was really only after 1966 when they got a majority of about 100, when they could have been expected to do more. And again, O'Neill comes over, they talk to him, but they don't really do anything. And it isn't until Duke Street and the violence that becomes a big issue, as Alban says, an international issue, an embarrassment to Britain, that the pressure begins to be put on. But essentially, British policy from then right down to internment and beyond internment, at least to internment, was we got to change, they got to be forced to change, as unions got to be forced to change, but we don't want to take over directly. We don't want to be sucked back in to Irish politics. That was the basic line. And that was, I think, really pretty disastrous, because all it did was split the Unionist Party. So even when reforms were introduced, when O'Neill made a commitment to introduce one person, one vote, to reform local Chichester Clark, to reform local government, set up the central housing body, all the rest of it, most Catholics didn't believe the reforms were here to stay, because they could see the right inside the Unionist Party, were going right up to the cabinet and all the rest of it. So they didn't believe in the reform process. So you've got a situation where British troops are in from August 69, the British troops were there, as you say, before August 69, but there's very, very significant. It's the first time they're on the streets of Derry and Belfast in a big way, really, since the 1930s. at the same time, increasingly they're seen as keeping unionists in power. So that's a recipe for radicalisation of Catholic politics, for more support for republicanism. And I think that's why I think the violence, serious, long-term violence, wasn't inevitable. It could have been cut through, but it was down to Britain. The unionists couldn't deal with the problem, obviously.
Well, just on the lines of the violence wasn't inevitable because the state could have actually conceded the basic civil rights that actually were requested. So the right of a job, the right of a house, and the right to vote. There weren't massive sort of demands that actually were being made at that particular time. But of course the state was based around discrimination and gerrymandering and needed to have those things. And partition was the first act of violence that brought on the British government's direct hand in that. It was very clear within it. And again, in relation to Stormont, the British government were still the masters at the end of the day. It was their responsibility and control. And it was, their troops were here, the garrison troops all the time before that. And the RUC were very clearly under the control of the British government as regards security. Stormont actually had a sort of a minor role as regards monitoring it and managing it at that particular time. But the special powers, despite all of the changes that actually were happening even at that stage in relation to reform, that the Special Powers Act was still in place, and that was a very valid structure that actually was in place. So I think nationalists started to realise that despite the small changes that were being made, that actually it wasn't going to really change the nature of the state itself, because the state was going to be enforced by British rule. You know, and very often whenever the troops come in, people saw it in various different ways. One was protecting the Catholics, and the other was, you know, they were coming in to put the RUC out, and there's various different structures to protect the Battle of the Bogside. But the reality is they come in to protect British interests in Ireland, and the state had actually collapsed, their artificial state, and they were coming in to protect British interests, and that's what they're there for to continue. So violence wasn't inevitable. The demands could have been met, and the normal democratic process within the North, without the gerrymandering actually had happened around the district councils. And an awful lot of that gerrymandering is still in existence. Some would say that PPS 14 is still gerrymandering of the present situation to ensure that there are not a number of people who are building houses west of the Bann who actually would keep the balance right across the state. So the state hasn't changed that much in actually how it actually has managed the situation as we go along. But it is important, I think, that we identify that the civil rights campaign itself was actually to try and bring people together. The inclusive nature of it was actually to bring all the political structures and those who weren't involved in politics together to actually start to mass demonstration and to mobilise people and to give people confidence to actually challenge the state itself. So the violence part of it, and I know Albin in a letter reply to myself actually said that it was the IRA campaign actually that brought it, and was impossible to actually maintain protesters in the street. But I was in Armagh in the Cathedral Road when John Gallagher was shot by the B Specials. There was no IRA about. So you know, to blame the IRA for everything that actually happened is false in that situation. And the first reaction to mass protest and peaceful demonstration come from the enforcement of the B Specials. You know, you see the programmes here in Belfast, the various different structures actually happened right across the north to ensure that the state maintained control. And so the violence, that the only violence that was inevitable was that the state's reaction and the state's violence to peaceful protest was to shoot people on the street.
Bernadette wants to get in, and then Oban, and then I'll take somebody from the floor.
Yeah, I think the question raises two very key elements. As you know, we have almost been conditioned to review the situation as some terrible squabble that happened between ourselves when Mother England wasn't watching. You know, and that the only claim to be laid against the British state is that of neglect of troublesome children. And they didn't deal with us sternly enough when we were misbehaving by poking fun at each other, getting into rows, and finally coming to blows and guns at each other. And that's now almost universally accepted in the discussion that was the problem of the British state. And I think that's the first thing that has to be challenged. Because at the very core of democracy is that the government is supposed to be, and is charged with, and is paid to, that's what people pay their taxes and things for, paid to provide good, equal, fair, just government. So the people who were the government, I mean, there weren't two states here. There was only the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland. And the local administration, which is now an assembly, at that point was the Stormont government. But it was at all times answerable to, not parallel with, and not independent of. It was answerable to the British government. And the legal and constitutional, inasmuch as a monarchy has a constitution, the legal and constitutional responsibility for the well-being of every person in Northern Ireland as a citizen of that state, whether they wanted to be or not, didn't matter. That's what they were. And the duty of care and the duty of fairness, the duty of equality, lay with the sovereign government. So the nature of the British state and its attitude to those of its citizens, willing or unwilling, in this part of their state is a key factor. And therefore key responsibility for allowing this state to fester from partition until it exploded lies with nobody other than successive British governments. How the people then beneath that responded to it is another question that we can examine. But the key responsibility lies with, and the key situation to be examined, is why the British government in part of the United Kingdom allowed the situation to develop that developed here. Why did they allow a paramilitary police force to operate almost at will? Why did they allow one political party representing a particular majority, just a particular majority, have essentially one party rule from partition until the administration fell? You know, that's what happened. We had a one-party state until the administration itself collapsed. And then in the context of that, to ask about violence, I was listening to Patricia. Again, we have to look at that overall and strategic question, not who threw the first stone, who fired the first shot, and where were all the nice people when it happened. Too late for that question. The core question is whether, in fact, the existence of the state was itself a violation of democracy. That question needs to be looked at. You know, people have different views. But violence comes from violation. And violence is what we all consider is what our opponents did. But there is act and there is omission. There is overt and there is covert. The violence of the poverty, that's real pain. The violence of the poverty that was inflicted on people. The violence of the human indignity, of unemployment and discrimination that was visited on people. Just go down to Tiger Bay. Did you see in the village? The old people, still in the 21st century with a new assembly, tottering out in their slippers to the outside toilet in the middle of the night. But that's not violence, because the only person that's getting hurt there is an old man in his slippers, and the pain doesn't show, and the marks can't be seen. But, so we first of all define violence as what our opponents do, and it's that degree of unacceptable physical behaviour that is worse than what we do ourselves. This state was born in violence, it was maintained in violence, of every conceivable description and definition of violence. The history of this country is one of violence and war, and the British Empire was built on nothing else. When the row started, who expected somebody to have an intellectual discussion on the matter? We were reared in it, we were steeped in it, the empire was built on it. All our Christian beliefs glorify sacrifice, and we want to ask ourselves the question, who started the war? Grow up.
Well, Bernadette's proposition is, if I understand it correctly, that the existence of the state was in itself a violation of democracy, that state was born in violence, maintained by violence, etc., and therefore...
I'm not saying that justified violence.
Well,
I'm saying it's endemic.
Yeah. And certainly I would accept that it is endemic, and I'm glad that you've qualified it to say that it doesn't justify violence. And that's the very point I was going to make. The fact is, the state was born in violence. It was maintained through violence by the unionist hegemony. And its reaction to civil rights was the traditional response, which was violence. But the biggest and most important political achievement since the foundation of the state was through civil rights. And that was a non-violent democratic campaign. And that brought unionism to its knees. And that brought down, and that destroyed the unionist hegemony. So the point that I'm making to you is this, and the gentleman that asked the question was saying to me, well, you've sort of jumped ahead and you've condemned the IRA for introducing violence. I've never said that. Never. And if Francie cares to read my letter, I haven't said that. But what I do say is this. That there were many people involved in violence, including the state, including various elements within unionism. And indeed, Paisleyism wasn't that far away from direct involvement in violence. But what I'm saying to you is this, that the achievement of civil rights was, despite the fact that we were conceived in violence and the state was immersed in violence, that through non-violence we achieved more. We achieved more as a community in a period of about 18 months than the previous 50 years of sporadic violence against the state. The violence against the state did not work. And the consequent violence of the provisional IRA did not work. And that is an historic fact. And I think that is unchallengeable. And what Bernadette has said, the existence of the state was a violation of democracy. The state still exists. And the same arguments apply today as applied in 1968, as applied in 1969, 1972, 1974, 1985, 1994, 1998, and today. The same position applies. So what's changed? And the point I'm making to you is this, that in relation to the violence that the IRA embarked on in 1970 or thereabouts, that violence was offensive violence, not defensive. We all remember what happened in Belfast and Derry and elsewhere as a result of state violence. And people in that situation were quite entitled to defend themselves where they were left without any civic power protecting them.
Even violently.
But let me say this. Let me say this. They're entitled to defend their homes. They're entitled to defend themselves. But what I am saying to you is this, that the embarkation by the IRA on an offensive campaign from 1970 onwards was not justified and was subversive of civil rights, and in fact did great damage to civil rights. Now that is an historic reality that I think people have to face. And it is a challenge to any Republicans in this audience to reflect on what happened over that period of time. And the other point I make is this, that the IRA campaign was the reintroduction of the national question into politics at that point in time, when politics over that period of two years or so was dominated by civil rights and dominated by discussions about how we rebuilt society here and rebuilt politics. Now, I think that that is important to remember, that not only was it subversive in terms of the methodology that was used, that is violence, offensive violence, but also it was subversive in the sense that it actually undermined the basic campaign of civil rights and introduced the national question at a time when it was unnecessary and which played into the hands of unionist and unionist politicians, because they were happiest in a situation where the national question was the central political issue. I'll leave it there.